It all started the day my son finally moved back home after finishing college. My wife and I were thrilled to welcome him into our peaceful neighborhood. Nestled in a quiet lakefront community governed by an HOA, everything seemed normal. Karen from down the street noticed him unloading boxes into our guest house. Within minutes, she was marching up the driveway, demanding to know who he was and whether he was authorized to live there. We tried to keep things civil, explaining he was our son and would be staying long-term. But it didn't matter. Karen had already made up her mind. She kept glancing at him suspiciously, then stormed off, muttering something about HOA rules and unauthorized tenants. We figured she'd cool off and let it go. We were wrong. Just hours later, 2 patrol cars rolled up in front of our house. That's when I realized Karen had called the cops and her own neighbors over something as simple as a son moving back in. The officers looked uncomfortable, especially once they heard our side of the story. But the tension in the air was thick. My wife, who had just gotten home from work, stepped out to see what was going on. She was still in uniform and carrying her ID badge. That's when everything shifted. Karen's eyes locked on the badge, and her expression changed in an instant. But what was on that bajant, who my wife really was, would leave Karen absolutely stunned. Karen stood frozen, eyes locked on the badge hanging from my wife's lanyard. The smug expression she wore earlier completely disappeared. You could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to process what she was looking at. My wife didn't say a word. She just calmly stepped between the officers and our son, then handed one of them her credentials. The officer gave a slight nod of recognition and immediately shifted his tone. Karen's mouth dropped open, but she stayed quiet, something that didn't happen often. Now, to understand how we got here, you need to know a bit more. We'd lived in this HOA community for over 10 years, always paid our dues, followed the rules, and mostly kept to ourselves. Karen, however, had only moved in a year ago and somehow crowned herself the self-appointed neighborhood enforcer. From lawn lengths to mailbox designs, she found a way to turn the smallest things into HOA violations. And when new people moved, Enor in this case, moved back, she saw it as her duty to investigate. Our son had only been here a day, and she was already treating him like an intruder. She didn't care that he was family or that he had every right to be here. To her, he didn't look like someone who belonged. That's what made her call the cops in the first place. But what Karen didn't realize was that my wife's job wasn't just some tight-lipped, carried serious authority. And now, things were about to shift as the officers stepped aside. Clearly recognizing the weight behind my wife's ID badge, Karen's frustration bubbled back to the surface. She pointed at our son again, her voice shaky but loud. He was out late last night walking around. That's suspicious behavior in this neighborhood. One of the officers looked back at her, unimpressed. Ma'am, walking outside isn't a crime. But Karen wasn't done. He doesn't even have a parking decal. That's an HOA rule violation. What she didn't know was that the HOA board had already approved our son's return. I had the email printed and ready, just in case. But Karen never cared about facts. She thrived on control, and when she didn't have it, she'd make a scene. That was her pattern intimidate report. Escalate, meanwhile, our son was just trying to settle back into normal life. After graduating from college, he needed a quiet place to job hunt and get on his feet. He didn't expect to be under surveillance by the neighbor across the street. Every movement he made, walking to the mailbox, unloading groceries, even jogging, somehow triggered another concerned citizen email from her. Even more frustrating, a few other neighbors had quietly confessed they'd been targets too. One woman said Karen reported her for hanging a wind chime. Another was fined for having a welcome mat that didn't match community colors. It was becoming clear that Karen was more than just annoying. She was creating tension across the whole block. But my wife and I had a plan brewing. We knew confronting Karen head-on wouldn't work. That only added fuel to her fire. So instead, my wife began quietly documenting everything: dates, times, even screenshots of messages Karen had sent to the HOA board. My son kept a journal too, noting every time she stared him down from her porch or walked past our house pretending to talk on the phone. The pattern was clear, and it wasn't just paranoia. Karen was targeting our family and others in the neighborhood, hiding behind HOA rules to justify her actions. Tension grew when a formal complaint was suddenly filed against us anonymous. Of course, accusing our son of loitering and creating discomfort for other residents. But strangely, none of our neighbors had a problem with him. In fact, many had begun speaking up in private about their own run-ins with Karen. A few even suggested she might be using her position on the HOA committee to push personal agendas. We decided to attend the next HOA meeting, but not quietly. My wife, in full uniform, walked in with a folder of evidence, her presence alone enough to make half the room sit straighter. Karen's eyes widened the second she saw her. Still, she kept her composure, acting like none of this had anything to do with her. But then something unexpected happened. Just as we were about to present our case, the HOA president interrupted with an announcement someone else had filed a separate complaint, and this time it had nothing to do with our son. The room went quiet as the HOA president unfolded. A second letter, anonymous again, but this one accused Karen of overstepping her authority and harassing multiple residents. For the first time since all this started, Karen didn't have that smug look on her face. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her smile tightened into a nervous twitch. You could feel the shift in the room. Suddenly, she wasn't the one in control anymore. The president said the board would be reviewing the complaint, and until then, Karen would be temporarily suspended from any HOA duties. Her face went pale. My wife and I exchanged glances, surprised but cautious. It was clear someone else in the neighborhood had had enough to end. That meant we weren't alone. That night, a neighbor we barely knew knocked on our door. She introduced herself and quietly admitted she was the one who filed the complaint. She had kids too, and after watching how Karen treated our son, she couldn't stay silent. It was the first time in weeks that I felt something shift from isolation to support. But just when we thought things were cooling down, my son came home looking shaken. Someone had followed him while he was walking the dog's same gray sedan parked down the block, engine running. He didn't recognize the driver, but he was sure they were watching him. Now, it wasn't just HOA politics, it was something more personal. And we had no idea how deep it was going to go. The next morning, I drove my son to school myself, just to be safe. But as we pulled out of the driveway, I spotted that same gray sedan creeping down the block. I didn't confront it, not yet. Instead, I looped around the neighborhood and caught the plate number. Once my son was safely inside the school building, I made a call to my wife. She didn't hesitate. Within hours, she'd run the plate through her official system. Turned out, the car was registered to Karen's cousin, someone who had been involved in a previous HOA dispute years back in another state. That connection made everything snap into focus. Karen hadn't just been acting alone, she was leaning on family to intimidate us. Later that week, the board called a special HOA meeting. This time, my wife came along, dressed in full uniform with her federal badge plainly visible. The hush that fell over the room was immediate. Karen tried to act unfazed, but when the board confronted her with the evidence witness statements, the surveillance complaint, and the plate number, her voice cracked. She stammered something about just wanting peace. But no one was buying it. The board voted unanimously to remove her from all HOA involvement and issue a formal warning. As we left the meeting, a quiet round of applause broke out. test. When I thought it was finally over, I got a call that same night from a blocked number. A voice whispered, "This isn't finished yet." Then they hung up. That call shook me more than I expected. Not because of the threat, it was vague and weak, but because it reminded me how far this whole situation had spiraled. From the moment my son moved in, what should have been a peaceful chapter in our lives had turned into constant tension, thanks to Karen and her petty need for control. But I wasn't about to live in fear over anonymous calls. I reported the incident to local law enforcement and let them handle the rest. After that, things actually started to settle down. The HOA sent out a community-wide notice reinforcing proper conduct and discouraging harassment of any kind. Karen kept a low profile, probably knowing that any further drama could get her into real trouble. The strange car never showed up again, and we finally felt like we could breathe. My son eventually made friends around the neighborhood, and the awkward stares turned into casual waves. People realized we weren't here to disrupt, we were here to live just like anyone else. As for my wife, her quiet presence alone kept the peace. Nobody wanted to test the limits again.